When it comes to overclocking, this is a subject that I find many people within the PC gaming community surprisingly aren't actually on board with. Me personally, the idea that you can tinker around with some settings and extract extra performance out of your components is quite appealing. I mean, who doesn't want more FPS and smoother gameplay? However, if it comes at the cost of potentially hours of tuning, high power consumption, noise, heat, etc., then I can understand why this is a territory many do not venture into. The question arises, how much performance are you missing out on? Is it even worth it? Well, to answer this question, I spent some time overclocking and tuning my test gaming rig, and then benchmarked 22 modern titles to show you guys what's being left on the table. Let's discuss that in this video. This video is brought to you by Ugreen and their Nexo 300-watt gallium nitride charger, a powerhouse for all your charging needs. If you're like me, you probably have a number of devices at your workstation, perhaps a laptop, a work phone, a personal phone, wireless buds, and maybe a portable game console. All those devices need their own chargers, which creates quite a mess. That's where Ugreen's Nexo 300-watt charger comes in. It'll clear up that clutter by allowing you to charge 5 devices simultaneously. It features 4 USB-C ports with one dedicated 140-watt port that can charge a 16-inch MacBook Pro from 0 to 55% in 30 minutes, and a single USB-A port, all in a compact form factor. Along with that, it supports all the latest fast charging standards such as PD 3.1 to save you a lot of time. However, what sets this charger apart is its use of advanced gallium nitride chips. These chips not only deliver powerful energy but also ensure excellent cooling performance. The built-in thermal guard system prevents overheating and overcharging, making this charger safe and efficient. Experience the future of charging with the Ugreen Nexo 300-watt gallium nitride charger. Check it out using the link in the video description and take advantage of their holiday sale with up to 50% off. Hey, what is going on, guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel, and I hope you've all been doing well. Today we're gonna be diving deep into a topic that's been on my mind for a while now, overclocking. Sure, we've dabbled into it before, exploring RAM speeds, scaling, and even focusing on individual components like an overclocked GPU. But it's been a hot minute since we've taken a step back and looked at the bigger picture, which is overclocking your entire system and comparing that against a bone stock system. I did a poll earlier this month, and I asked you guys a simple question, which was, do you overclock your PC? And I'll be honest, I was surprised to see that 61% of people who voted said they do not overclock and tune their gaming rigs. Apart from enabling your RAM's XMP profile, which isn't really overclocking, so that means most of you prefer to run your system stock. Now, 20% said they overclock everything. That includes the GPU, CPU, RAM, tightening timings, tuning power limits, thermal limits, etc. Basically, whatever you can adjust that will help boost performance, they will mess around with it. I'm someone who falls into this crowd because to me the whole aspect of PC gaming involves tinkering around with your hardware. The concept that you can take a component and adjust some settings to extract more performance out of it appeals a lot to me. It's just the background where I come from, where this was part of the PC gaming hobby. Now, 7% said they only overclocked the GPU, and I thought this number would have actually been higher because overclocking a graphics card is probably the easiest component these days. Then 12% said you only do the GPU and CPU.
I overclock everything. Overclocking is my first hobby, and I have more fun when overclocking than gaming. Honestly, Danny, up to 10% is more or less nothing to me. I'd prefer better thermals rather than overclocking for a boost that I can't tangibly see.
I don't think overclocking is worth it anymore. You gain a few FPS for a huge bump in power consumption. I have undervolted my CPU and GPU and gained a few FPS because of lower temps, and the power usage have dropped approx 150 watt.
There is really no need to overclock CPUs and GPUs anymore since their boost algorithms are so good. All you gain is a couple percent performance while increasing system instability and crashes. Games are unstable enough these days without adding more instability into the system.
It was fun back in the days when you actually can see a difference. Nowadays, it's pretty much top off. Just plug and play.
I used to OC anything I could LOL, but these days I just enable XMP and call it a day. I can't be bothered messing with the CPU and GPU when OC does nothing. I upgrade almost every gen, so there's no need for me to squeeze any performance out something that's already fast out of the box.
Alright, so it seems like what a lot of these comments have in common is that many believe these days that there's no point in overclocking anymore because it doesn't really get you much performance as it did back in the day, and to an extent that is true. I mean, you take a look at AMD CPUs and those chips are basically tapped out. Sure, you might be able to get a bit of performance out of them when using Curve Optimizer, but other than that, there's really not a whole lot of headroom left there. And these days, when you have AMD taking a huge chunk of the market share in the DIY space, at least when it comes to CPUs, you'll get a lot of people believing that. When I tested my RTX 4090 last year, I did do another follow-up video exploring overclocking and concluded that it wasn't really worth it considering the performance gain was so minuscule at the expense of more power draw, but I was also testing with a slower CPU too, so I've been meaning to retest this as well. After reading the comments and reviewing the results from the poll, I thought I would make this video for you guys where I benchmark a wide variety of modern games with my test system at stock. Nothing overclocked besides the XMP profile for my RAM being enabled, but other than that, everything is basically stock. After that, I overclocked my CPU, GPU, RAM with tightened timings, raised power limits, and did some other tweaks to try and push this system as much as I could, and then tested the games again. The purpose of this test is to see how much performance is being left on the table if you don't overclock and tune your system. We'll have a whole discussion on whether or not it was worth it. Are you better off just leaving things stock? Should you tune? Is it a waste of time? After looking at the results, because, there is quite a bit of data to get through here, so I want to get that out of the way first. Now, to give you guys a rundown of my test system specifications, we've got an Intel Core i9-13900K, which I have overclocked to 5.7 GHz for its P cores, 4.6 GHz for its E cores, and the ring is overclocked to 5.1 GHz. The RAM we're using here is Team Group's T-Create 32GB kit, which comes with an XMP profile rated to run at 7200 megatransfers CL34, but I was able to push that to 7600 megatransfers CL36, albeit the other timings were tightened, so latency-wise it is actually lower. The motherboard is an MSI Z790 Carbon Wi-Fi. The GPU is also an MSI RTX 4090, which of course is also overclocked. We've got a plus 205 offset to the core, which allows it to run at around 3 GHz, and the memory also has a plus 1500 offset, allowing it to effectively run at 24 gigabits per second. For the rest of the system specs, you guys can check the video description down below. With that out of the way, it's time we take a look at our gaming benchmarks, and starting us off is Alan Wake 2. This is the new game on the block that a lot of people have been talking about, one for its visuals and two for how it brings a lot of people's hardware to its knees. Now, I didn't go crazy with settings here, we're just using high settings with no RT, and I find the game still looks very visually appealing. With those settings, we can see pretty good numbers from both configs. At 1080p, there's a difference of 9% for the average FPS and 13% for the 1% lows. At 1440p, we can see the margin close to 7% and 6% respectively, and at 4K, the gap for the average FPS is the same, but we can see a 9% gap for the 1% lows. The stock numbers would give you a totally playable experience. Next up, we have Starfield, a new title which I found to be hilariously bad when it comes to performance. When it comes to visuals, it's not outstandingly better than titles from like 5+ years ago, but performs like it has ray tracing on or something, which, it also doesn't even include that. I did the test with the new patch that helped boost performance on Nvidia cards, but even then I feel like there's still quite a lot of work left to do with this title when it comes to optimization. I also found it interesting that as we bump up the resolution, the margins between our stock and overclocked config actually grows larger. The next game we have is Remnant 2, and this title seems to show pretty decent scaling as opposed to the last two games we looked at. At 1080p, our average FPS grew by 16% and 14% for the 1% lows. At 1440p, the margins close, but it's still decent. Then at 4K, we see our margins for the average FPS doesn't change a whole lot, but our 1% lows are 17% better, resulting in smoother gameplay. In The Last of Us Part 1, we can see that at 1080p, by overclocking, we improved performance by 8% for the average FPS and 13% for the 1% lows, though the stock performance wasn't bad either. Still, that's a nice bump for our 1% lows. At 1440p, we see a 7% increase for our average FPS, but barely anything for our 1% lows. However, at 4K, we can see again that while the margin for the average FPS doesn't change much, we then see a 9% increase in our 1% lows, which is similar behavior that we saw in Remnant 2. Moving on, and we have Baldur's Gate 3 tested in Act 3, and you can tell just by looking at the results across the two configurations and 3 resolutions how it's primarily dependent on the CPU performance, and therefore RAM also plays a role there too, as the margins at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K don't change by any significant amount, and performance is also the same. Bumping up the resolution from 1080p to 4K barely drops performance, which indicates a primary CPU bottleneck. But we can see how in this CPU limited scenario, overclocking the CPU and also the RAM provided us with a decent performance uplift. Hogwarts Legacy is a game that shows really good scaling at 1080p when we overclocked our system. We saw an improvement of 23% for the average FPS and 34% for our 1% lows. The overall experience was much smoother once we tuned our system. Even at 1440p, we saw a decent performance uplift, 18% for the average and 16% for the 1% lows. Then at 4K, we become primarily GPU bound, but still saw 8% improvement all around. In Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, we can see how at 1080p and 1440p, our average FPS has a bit of an improvement, though 1% lows barely improve, but interestingly, the situation at 4K is the opposite, where average FPS doesn't change by a whole lot, but the margin for 1% lows is larger, so I found that to be quite intriguing. In Forza Horizon 5, while we can see really good performance from the stock configuration, we can still extract a bit of extra performance across all three resolutions when we overclock our system, though it's not really necessary for a title like this. I play this game quite a bit on my 4K OLED when I'm in the mood to just sit back and drive around, and at a locked 120 FPS, this level of performance is more than adequate, but we'll circle back to this after we go through the rest of the results. Next up, we have Hitman 3, and I probably should have at least turned on ray tracing for this title, since we had so much headroom here, which makes sense when you think about it. This game is still running on an old engine that was released in 2016, with some improvements and tweaks that they have done over time. At 1080p, where we are primarily CPU bound, we can see double-digit margins for the average and 1% lows, 16 and 18% respectively. Then at 1440p, we saw that margin drop to 7% and 9%, and at 4K, the average FPS doesn't change by a whole lot, but we still get a nice 10% improvement for our 1% lows. Overall though, no complaints from either config, and if you haven't checked this game out since its World of Assassination update, definitely do so, it's quite a lot of fun. Red Dead Redemption 2 shows us quite the large performance bump to our average FPS when we overclock our system, nearly 30%, but for our 1% lows, they improved by a mere 11%, so it may not be as smooth as the average FPS implies. I tested in the city of Saint-Denis, which is the busiest area in the game. At 1440p, we see the gains aren't as impressive, still 12% for the average FPS, and 11% for the 1% lows, I guess that's decent. Then at 4K, we just see a marginal improvement as we're more GPU bound, and in this title our GPU overclock doesn't do a whole lot. Moving on, and we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 2022, and I thought this game would have shown us some pretty impressive improvements with our overclocked system, but we can see that across all three resolutions the margins are practically the same, 8% at 1080p and 1440p, and 7% at 4K. Regardless, performance even out of the stock system was adequate, but I know there's many people out there whose desire it is to ensure they get every frame they can get out of their system for this game. Fortnite, on the other hand, shows us some better scaling, where at 1080p we get a bump of 9% for our average FPS, but we see a solid 22% increase in our 1% lows. At 1440p, both of those margins close up to 5% and 11% respectively. Then at 4K, the performance difference is basically negligible. So the last game we're going to take a look at is Far Cry 6, and I did have ray tracing turned on in this title. Across all three resolutions, we see pretty good performance scaling, and more specifically, we see that our overclocked config did help significantly with 1% lows. Interestingly, we see that the largest margin is with our 1% lows at 4K, which again is kind of bizarre. Usually you'd expect to see the larger frame time improvements at lower resolutions. Alright, so after going through various games and looking at the results, we can see that overall the performance difference between our stock configuration and our overclocked PC wasn't anything dramatic. It's about a 10% difference across the board and across the three different resolutions. With that said though, there were some titles that did benefit greatly from our overclock. It's just that most of the titles weren't showing any drastic improvements. We can take a look at the percentage difference charts across the resolutions as we're discussing further. Now here's the thing with overclocking. At the end of the day, it's a very your mileage may vary sort of situation. Some people can luck out and hit the silicon lottery, and their components will overclock really far, granting them greater gains. On the other hand, you may not get so lucky, and your components may barely provide any further headroom than stock. With my components here, I definitely didn't hit the silicon lottery. I've seen guys able to clock their 13900Ks to 5.9 or even 6 GHz all-core, and I've even seen some people clock their 4090s to 3200 MHz. If I really wanted to, I probably could have taken my overclocks further, but that also would have required quite a bit more work for maybe another 5%. Like, if I had delidded my 13900K and used direct die cooling, I probably could have pushed it to like 5.8 or 5.9 GHz. If I had flashed the VBIOS of my 4090 Gaming X Trio to one that has a 633 watt limit, like the Galax cards, maybe I could have pushed it further. Granted, the silicon could handle it. If I had a 2-DIMM motherboard like the ROG Apex, I'd probably be running 8000 MHz with the same tight timings, maybe lower. But then at that point, personally, I feel like I'd be venturing into some more extreme territory. But I'm not gonna lie, sometimes I let my curiosity get the better of me, so I may look into it. In regards to the overall performance differences, the reason why I'm not surprised here is because the 13900K and 4090 are top tier high-end components. And when it comes to these kinds of components, they're already pushed quite a bit from the factory, so it's not like we had a ton of headroom here to begin with. I would argue that with lower end components, you'd actually see a larger difference. Take the 13600K for example. Out of the box, it boosts to 5.3 GHz, whereas the 13900K already does like 5.6. But you can also overclock the 13600K to 5.6 or 5.7 GHz, so there's more headroom there. So if you were to do the comparison between that versus stock, you'd actually see a larger margin. It's the same thing with lower end GPUs as well. I recall my 3060 Ti showed better scaling with overclocking than my RTX 3080 did. Now, this might be a topic worth revisiting again with lower end or mainstream components. Circling back to the comments people had left on my poll, I can definitely see where you're coming from. As we just saw, there are many titles where the differences were negligible. Overclocking can be a long and tedious process depending on the component you're dealing with and how much you want to stress test your components to ensure stability. Memory overclocking, especially DDR5, was an absolute nightmare on its own. GPUs, not so much. It's quite easy when using a tool like MSI Afterburner, but there's still quite a bit of time you have to invest. And you might not want to do any of that. You just want to play your games after coming home from your job and just want to, sit back, relax, and just spend time immersed in whatever it is that you're playing rather than spending time looking at RAM test or OCCT. I totally get that. Adding on to this, I guess we should be happy that instead of having a whole lot of headroom left on the table, these modern chips have more intelligent boost algorithms that are able to extract most of the performance out of the box. The 13900K with Intel's thermal velocity boost can reach 5.8 GHz on a couple cores, but most of the time at stock, the all-core frequency is around 5.4 or 5.5, which isn't too far from our manual OC. I remember when I started this channel, I was using the i5-6600K at the time, and that CPU had a stock boost clock of 3.9 GHz, but I was able to overclock it myself all the way to 4.6 GHz, so that was a 700 MHz improvement, so there was quite a bit of headroom available on that chip that it just wasn't taking advantage of stock. The other advantage here is that with the 4090, I made a video shortly after my review exploring undervolting and power limiting, and the thing is, with the 4090 at stock, it's already a blazing fast GPU, and since overclocking doesn't yield any drastic improvements, you're actually better off just going that route where you can keep stock performance, but you can drop power significantly, in some cases over 100 watts, at the same exact FPS. May not be that big of a deal to people in areas where electricity is really cheap, but if you do live in an area with high cost for electricity, could be helpful. On top of that, you do also get less heat, less noise, so there's a plus there. Now, one comment I've seen come up is that you're concerned that if you overclock, you'll decrease the lifespan of your components. Now, there is a risk involved, but these days it's very small. Unless you're being absolutely stupid with voltages and you're not adequately cooling your components, then you don't really have much to be worried about. So at the end of the day, it really just comes down to user preferences, and this is what I love about gaming on the PC. You can customize your experience the way you want, and if you want to dive deeper into the hardware aspect of it, you can take advantage of overclocking methods to get a performance bump where needed. Otherwise, you should be happy that modern components provide such good performance out of the box these days, so you can spend more time playing your games or using your software rather than tuning. With all that said, the question I asked at the start of the video was, with the performance that's left on the table, is overclocking worth it to attain that difference? Well, I'm not going to give you the answer to that question because I don't have one for you. Only you can answer that question for yourself. Some people will look at these results and say, yeah, that makes no difference to me. I'm fine with enabling XMP and leaving everything as is, and that's totally fine if you're satisfied. That's all that matters. Now, on the other hand, I do know that there are people out there that absolutely find it worth it to go through the hours of stress testing their rigs and ensuring that, their overclocks are stable so they can get every last frame out of it. The choice is really yours. Alrighty guys, so that's gonna do it for this one. I hope the information presented in this video was in some way helpful. As for now, we'll touch base in the next video. If you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining, then leave a like. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. Be sure to check out the video description for cool links and ways to support the channel, such as using my Amazon affiliate link. And if you're interested in seeing more content like this, then consider subscribing. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.